It's a massive issue. It seems cut and dried on the surface that yes, we all want cheap data, free data, we all want cheap lots of things, and we all want data costs to fall. But since we've been looking at it, we understand that this is a very complex and complicated subject, and Leon is going to talk through some of the issues today. In fact, it is so complex that we originally decided we were going to have one media briefing to look at data costs, data must fall, and then also to combine that with looking at the ICT white paper, the ICT policy white paper. But there is so much to this subject that we've decided to split it. Today we're looking at data costs alone, and you'll be surprised at the wide-ranging issues that we've brought into this. And then in early January, we'll be looking at the ICT white paper. We don't have a date as yet, but we'll let you know as soon as possible. The data must fall bandwagon is just astounding in the way that it's captured public imagination and public and media indignation. But perhaps we think without a clear grasp of all the underlying facts. The Free Market Foundation's interest in this subject stems first and foremost, well, primarily, because we are anxious to prevent unnecessary knee-jerk government intervention with unnecessary regulation. We are against all unnecessary regulation per se. And that's the driving force as to why we are looking at this subject. We want the facts to be known. We want a proper analysis and interrogation of all the issues that are driving the data costs in this country, and we feel that that hasn't been done to date. It's been a fairly superficial getting hold of a few headline comparisons without looking at all the underlying factors that actually affect costs of data. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Another interesting point is it is not South Africa alone that is calling for data costs to come down. Quite a few countries, it's the same theme. So today, Leon Louw, the Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation, is going to talk to you. And it's quite a long, in-depth presentation, so I think we'll keep questions to the end if that suits everybody. And look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you. Leon.
Well, hi everyone. Yes, it is, I'm afraid, a complex issue and therefore a long presentation. I'm going to make it as brief as I can. And maybe because it's a relatively small and I can see quite well-informed group, there can be interruptions if you want me to stop at some point and clarify something, rather than wait until the end, because I'm going to cover a wide range of issues and we'll skip over some necessarily to get going. I also will say that I'm going to raise questions that I think have not been asked, and that's itself quite disturbing in all the public hype, the parliamentary hearings, and articles and columns by very informed people to whom I look up with great esteem and respect, and am frankly quite surprised by some of what I've seen, which seems to be ill-considered or hasn't really thought through the issues. So let's start with the problem. Essentially, everyone agrees that mobile charges are a rip-off. Everyone agrees that network providers make excess profits. There's no debate about this. Everyone agrees that data prices must fall. There's no debate of any consequence. And there is lots of evidence. So what is the evidence for these propositions, these basic memes or axioms of truth? And are they correct? To what extent are they correct? Let's interrogate that. Had a personal run-in with data providers. I've been a victim of outrageous data charges and have had public conflicts with data providers. And in fact, I have written a fairly widely circulated hostile Business Day column on the subject, and I have threatened a class action against data charges. So I've got myself firmly established as somebody who can hardly be called a front for the big interests. Vodacom sent some very senior people to come and meet with me in response to my critique and public and vocal challenges and threats of a class action, and we had a good meeting at which a lot was explained to me, and we agreed that what was explained to me was not available and readily knowable to the public and needed to be so, and Vodacom undertook to make changes to how it markets and communicates product availability, and we're working on that. We've been questioning MTN, who also approached us, as it happens, to look into this matter, and we have been asking tough questions of MTN. We've been contacting role players, eminent names in the field, one of whom I'll get into later on and who we invited but hasn't come. And we've gone to both sides, because in our view this matter is, the more we know about it, the more clear it becomes that pretty much no one knows anything about it. So we've interrogated it quite vigorously and are doing so. We're holding no punches. To give you some idea of my personal gripes, so I can get out of the way what later on might be seen as some kind of defense of the industry, let me start off with to establish my balance, or my bias for that matter. I got this SMS on that date, at this time, from my service provider telling me that I was about to run out of data and that I could buy 10 gigs of data for 750 Rand if I pressed the right buttons and dialed accordingly. I thought that was interesting because firstly the price per gig is cheaper than what we told the price per gig is, but on the other hand, when I did what I have to do to see how much data I actually got, this is my screen. I have a contract called Red Advantage, and it said to me 2 minutes later that I have 1.24 gigabytes of data available. So what in fact is happening there? How is this possible? Well, you can imagine that this makes me pretty angry and upset, and this is why I think there's an issue and a problem. So I've hardly been a willing supplicant. Then just more recently, I need a lot of data for my wife, who spends a lot of time in a little village with bad data access, and I saw this lovely ad in MTN's brochure, which is available in their stores, and I will show you if I find it here. There it is, called Yellow Deals, and it's pretty exciting. There you are. You can get, for 100 Rand a month, you can get a smartphone that does all sorts of fancy stuff, radio and flash camera and what have you, and 30 gigs of free data. And in fact, every one of the phones virtually in here that is on offer comes along with that same offer of, you can see the little black dot with each phone saying 30 gigs of free data. So I thought, well, that's obviously what I have to buy my wife. I went straight to one of the stores and wanted to buy this phone so she could have all of this free data for 2 years. And fortunately for me, I couldn't buy it because I didn't have proof of residence. I tried to explain that I live in the back of an abandoned car, and I couldn't see why you couldn't get a cell phone under those conditions, but it didn't work. Fortunately, though, it turned out that it's not so simple, because the very next issue of MTN's publication, a month later, November versus October, this is what it looks like. All of a sudden, note the change, the morph in the black dot. You see there, it just says 30 gigs of free data. Then all of a sudden, if you look very carefully, I need a magnifying glass, it says valid 30 days, once off has been added. So I said to the person in the store, what does that mean? Does it mean that if you've used only 15 gigs in your first month, that it lapses and you get another 30 gig that starts the next month? And they said, yes, that is so. I said, well, seems to me like a good deal and a lot cheaper than the public debate and the hype. So then I called the number at the bottom of each page that says you can call for information, small print. And they said, no, actually it lasts for 1 month and then it lapses, it's gone. So I said, are you truly saying that I have to, in my very first month, use 1 gig a day, and then I have none for the next 2 years? Is this seriously how it works? And they said, yes. And then I went to another store, the one in Rosebank, and they said, no. It's actually 30 gigs every month for 2 years. Now, I should imagine quite a lot of people have bought these phones. And the publication says very boldly that this is less complication has been added to the way things work. So, I to this moment don't know, and I've spent some time trying to find out what this actually means. Now, I should imagine there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who've bought one of these phones and are going to find, to their great rage, in the second month, they either don't have as much data as they thought, or maybe they have no data at all. And they will not have used up more than 1 gig a day, which seems to me quite difficult to know. That's a hell of a lot of porno flicks or whatever it is people use that data for. So there we are. That's the kind of problem I have. And the evidence is against the data providing companies, the network companies, very formidable. We know about the Data Must Fall campaign, and it is reported by My Broadband, one of the most useful sources of information on ICT for those who don't know, on the 15th of September. Thibaut Touch of Cliff Central, Gareth Cliff's partner, Touch Central FM, gave mobile networks 30 days to change their mobile data prices. Now, this is quite interesting that he's got the ability to tell Vodacom and MTN and Cell C and Telcom and so on. You know, it's obviously quite a formidable threat that he could issue such a threat and an ultimatum. But he does carry it through. He said that we will all move, whoever that is, everyone who, well, I suppose it's the whole of South Africa, it seems like everyone agrees with this, will move to the network that cares about its consumers. Well, it seems to me that if there is such a network, what's the fuss about? I mean, why not just do it? So that's my next question is, well, who is this? And why aren't they there already? Why is there any public discourse or debate about the issue? Then the report said that it is unclear whether AfriHost is behind Data Must Fall. Now, I don't know quite what that meant. Maybe some of you can tell me, but I sniffed around. Why is this supposedly the issue? Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Leave it there. I won't cover it again. So the question then is, what is this all about? Is this some sort of hidden agenda, some sort of secret conspiracy, some sort of collusion on the go here, that this Data Must Fall is in fact a front for AfriHost, which is a company that provides much cheaper data than the major network providers? Yes?
Sorry, Jan van Miller from My Broadband. Just to clarify that I put it in the proper context, AfriHost was very quick to move on the hashtag. They launched a promotion where you could buy.
Okay. Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
And they didn't want to answer questions about whether they're behind us in the first place. But subsequently, it's come out that no, they were just really quick to launch a promotion.
Okay. So, well, that was then that clarified. Thanks for doing that. And My Broadband, by the way, for those of, as I said, is a great source of information on these matters. And one of the few, by the way, if I may say, that has been balanced. It is one of the only sources in which I have seen some of the assumptions queried. But 702 reported that none of the network providers responded to the outcry. Now, again, you might point out that they did eventually, or at least some did, not all. There was some response. But if I may say, a very inadequate response. I thought it was somewhat strange, the lack of any engagement on these questions. So the Data Must Fall campaign goes on. It is said, for example, by this WITS unit, that it is becoming a human right. And there are all sorts of stuff in the literature that the United Nations supposedly declared data to be a human right. and that it's said to be a human right even by interpretation of the South African Constitution. And there's much more. The Right to Know campaign and the Alliance for Affordable Internet and the EFF and the DA have joined on the bandwagon, and the Communications Workers Union and various geeks. All the geeks I found who I thought would know everything seem to just assume that the data must fall hype is correct, yes.
I sort of have a problem with data must fall in a way.
Yeah.
I'm not against data falling, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't actually solve the problem with people's right to knowledge. Because they still don't necessarily have the technology that they need in order to access what they need to access. So surely if you're going to call for data to fall, you would also have to call for computer prices to fall?
And for smartphones to fall, yeah. And I would go further, and I would say then you would have to have newspapers and media and books and lectures and education, and every source of information would then have to be subject to the same principle. There's nothing special about data, especially since it's hard to get a handle on this, and maybe my broadband knows the detail better, but I couldn't find out how much of data is in fact really data, in other words, information, versus movies. For example, social media. It's said to be about 80% by some estimates. But on the other hand, lots of YouTube are educational YouTube. So what is YouTube? Is it fun? Is it entertainment? Is it data? So these things are very unclear. But nonetheless, if you are going to have data falling, then you must have everything else that's a source of information falling with it, maybe falling flat on its face. And I was quite fascinated by how little the ICT experts I knew and with whom we're in consultation seemed to know about the issue. There just seemed to be a kind of knee-jerk endorsement of the data must fall idea. Now, it might be correct. That's not the issue. The issue is that it was actually very difficult to find out what the objective information is and what the sources are. So virtually everyone sort of climbed on the bandwagon. And that, by the way, makes us in the Free Market Foundation spontaneously suspicious. We just don't like it when there is just a sort of unquestioned consensus on an issue. We think that usually there will be some countervailing information that is not being taken into account or being disclosed, and things are somewhat more complicated. The philosopher John Hospers, I remember, said before he died, he said he wants one day written on his gravestone, "It's not so simple." And I think that's how we feel when things seem to be simple. We assume they aren't so simple. So what really are the sophistications? Now, Arthur Goldstuck, probably one of the, if not the leading expert in the field in the country from Worldwide Works, has had quite a lot to write and say about it. And again, somebody for whom we have the highest respect and highest regard. But interestingly, in this case, we have asked if we could meet. We've asked to have a discussion with him. We invited him here today, and would love to find out to what extent he really has dug into the data and thought it through. He says, for example, that the campaign runs the risk of missing the point. Data prices have in fact plunged, he says, but not for the poor. So whereas the data must fall tends to be for people who want to be entertained by, for example, Cliff Central or Thibaut Touch, that his view is that the real issue is not people who have or can afford contracts, or for that matter, to respond to your question, the technology, you can have cell phones, but the poor, whatever that means. That data is expensive for the poor, and the argument is very simple, that if you have a contract that's very cheap, my Vodacom Red Advantage contract, for example, gives me 1 gigabyte of, quote, free, unquote, data per month. So I buy a contract, I get a very nice, Samsung 7 Edge and fancy high-tech stuff, and lots of voice and lots of SMSs, in fact unlimited, and a gig of data. So my data is essentially free. And his argument is that it's really the poor who can't afford such bundles and packages for whom data is extremely expensive, because they have to buy it at a few megabytes at a time. And then it does become exceedingly expensive. That is objectively correct. But quite why the poor should get anything free at all or cheap at all other than welfare, which is a different issue, because then would you have the same argument for housing and for food? Should food prices fall for the poor because the rich can afford bulk buying and nice food and so on? And what about transport and clothing and so on, and soccer tickets and beer and massages or whatever else? So then there's a 20 gigabyte monthly bundle from Cell C, he argues, to point out how cheap it is for the rich, which is only 500 Rand per month, or 2.5 cents per megabytes, 2.5 cents, and that's amongst the cheapest in the world. So he points out that in fact we have some of the cheapest data in the world, and his argument is that it's the poor that are the problem, and that the campaign has actually lost the plot. The plot is not about helping the rich, but in fact helping the poor. Then mobile chain charges are anti-poor, is his phrase, and because the poor don't have contracts. And there should be a price ceiling. He calls for a price ceiling of 20 to 40 cents per megabyte. And so he criticizes us in the Free Market Foundation in a private communication. I don't think he'll mind me sharing it with you, I hope not, for why are we bothering to research it? He says everything's known, it's all been written about, and there's no research to be done. The information is all perfectly adequately well established and documented. And so it's all been done, and we shouldn't be investing our time, and you should in fact not be attending this session. That is his view to us. I think he shares a mutual respect for each other, but nonetheless thinks we're wasting our time and energy on this issue. And to carry on with it, he then says only Telkom understood the message with airtime and offers cheaper prices, in which case again my question is, well then why the obsession with the ones that are more expensive? If there is affordable and cheap data available out of bundle or post-paid, why not get it? And so the queries for him would be, why should the poor get anything cheaper than what the market offers them stuff at? You don't have any argument regarding anything else that is clearly much more essential for the poor: clothing and food, transport, and I would imagine entertainment is actually quite an important thing for the poor, and media, other forms of media. And then also the question to him would be, the logic of saying Telkom offers good deals, well then why not settle for that? Why must everyone else offer the same deals and terms? Why one size fits all? Get on with it. Allow market competition and variations to play their role. Or is he suggesting flawed business models, that the ones who have higher charges just don't know how to run their business, in which case why worry? They will then lose out to the people who want to buy cheaper data. Or does he imply, or does anybody imply, that there's malice or collusion amongst the service providers? I haven't seen any direct allegation. There's sort of hints to that effect, in which case let's take them to the Competition Commission. But there's no concrete suggestion I could find anywhere to the effect of malice or collusion. And then what is the basis of the calculations? Why the numbers he comes up with? There's no disclosure that I find. I mean, maybe he's produced some, maybe he's done some sums, but I could not find any. And then the government response is that the chair of the portfolio committee, Ms. Kubai, she is reputed to have said, widely quoted throughout the press, many places, to have said that the network providers have a 30-day ultimatum to slash their prices. She did deny this on radio in a discussion with me, a panel. She and I were on a radio program, and she said she never said any such thing, and the portfolio committee never said any such thing, which they could not say. The portfolio committee cannot make such a ruling, cannot give an ultimatum. All the portfolio committee can do is make recommendations to the legislature, and you could give a recommendation, an ultimatum that you will recommend something to the legislature, but the legislature itself, by the way, is surprisingly toothless in such a matter, it would have to run through the executive branch of government and be turned into draft legislation that will to be tabled and go through the parliamentary process. So she denied having said it, although she's widely reputed to have done so. She does cite as authentic very dodgy and dubious sources, which I'm going to get to in a moment. And she seems to think they are reliable, in the absence, I might add, of what is a requirement of South African law at the moment, which is a socio-economic impact assessment. And she demands price transparency, which she understands to mean how does a service provider make up the charge? You know, how much are they recovering for SMSs, for airtime, for data? And the answer is that can't be known. Business doesn't work that way. There is no way of knowing, for example, if you sell dairy products, how much of the infrastructure and the capital and the labor and the interest and whatever have you goes into the yogurt, into the various cheeses, into the milk, into the long life, short life milk, whatever. You can't make those calculations. Business economics doesn't allow it. So so-called transparency shows a lack of understanding of how things work. MTN, Telkom, AfriHost and so on actually have no way of knowing how much the cost is of any one of the various products they provide. All they know is how they all aggregate in the end. And then ICASA is also, it seems, misquoted. ICASA is also accused or said to have, widely quoted as having given ultimatums that data prices must fall without any apparent logic for saying so, or any disclosed logic, other than this meme that it's too expensive. And then there just some more evidence. I've just selected some of the quotes that are doing the rounds for you to share. Your character, your carrier is gouging you, and we have the numbers to prove it, one of the headlines. And so it goes. If you go over your 300 megabyte limit with such and such a character, it'll cost you 310 Rand for 300 megabytes. These are all quotes that have been floating around in the media. If you use provider number 2, you won't pay more, but you'll be throttled to 2G. In other words, one of the providers will sell to you cheaply, but then they will throttle you into a slow 2G instead of 4G or LTE speed of data. If you visit the UK, you'll be paying provider number 3, 305 Rand per megabyte, and provider number 2 charges 19 for 25 megabytes. And so it goes, quote after quote about how you're being ripped off and how the ludicrous charges are being laid, and mobile data is a rip-off of costs, and so it goes. They say they are cheap, they say they're the best, but they're all far too expensive and ripping you off, and the banks don't know how to make money compared to the data providers. Companies make huge profits. Massive excessive profits are being said to be made, and that's proof that there's something wrong. And the number portability fails as telcos rip off consumers. These are headlines and articles in the press. There's one small catch, by the way, that none of those are from South Africa. This is being said and written about the same narrative, the same memes, the same lines, the same quotes. I converted dollars to rands in order to play this little trick, are in virtually every country. You go and search in every country for data must fall, data charges are exploitative, rip-off, whatever, and you will find the same being said. And so, now to where we stand on the FMF. Our concerns are the following. We all want cheap data and free data. In fact, we want cheap and free everything. There's nothing special about data. There's no reason why data should be any cheaper or freer than anything else. On the contrary, if there are going to be cheap and free things, then other stuff comes way ahead of data in the queue. But what we are is we are suspicious of hyperbole. We are worried about undisclosed agendas and emotive hype and knee-jerk endorsements. These concern us very substantially, and they raise a red flag for us, which is why we've decided to get involved. We worried about gullible experts who seem to have swallowed the memes and the axioms and the hyperbole floating about. We're fascinated by the unconvincing industry response. How come industry with billions of rands of budgets and the country's top media experts have failed to somehow respond in a way that has induced any confidence in anybody or given a response of any magnitude? And we're fascinated by the absence of tough questions. The sort of obvious questions that should be asked simply don't seem to be being asked, and if I may say, not just because they're here, with almost the single exception of my broadband, but very few, one or two other journalists, one or two other writers. Sorry? Yes, there are a few. There are a few that, but it's very rare and not making it into the high-profile media. Then we're concerned about the supremacy of constitutional rights, and we want things to be done according to the Constitution and human rights, and this is very, very central to all of our work and how we approach everything. And then we're interested in what data is really for. I've touched on that. Real data versus entertainment, and 80% supposedly is actually social media, and we can't really work out to what extent that is what you might call serious data or frivolous entertainment. And I personally, I have to say that I'm not a Facebooker and a Tweeter very much, but I consider that actually quite serious. I think people doing their personal and social things is not to be sniffed at. I'm not saying that you have to be learning about, medieval cooking or something in order to be doing something serious. And the FMF does have a bias, so let me disclose it immediately. We are pro-freedom and anti-regulation. So when we see the threat of regulation, we immediately become concerned and we immediately raise our hackles. So we ask these critical questions which we seem to think are lacking. Must data really fall? And if so, why must it fall? By how much must it fall? Who will benefit if it falls? At whose cost? Because the one thing economics teaches you is there are no benefits without costs. Who will pay the price for those who benefit? And what about undisclosed interests? What are the private sector interests, the interests of Thibaut Touch, of the data must fall followers and subscribers, of big and small business? The assumption is that private sector interests are big conglomerates. No. Often the most powerful and important private sector interests are small and emerging and new businesses who are paving the way for taking over what was previously the domain of bigger business. Then government, of course, is a big vested interest, and people somehow forget this, that the bureaucracy and politicians and government has a massive vested interest in regulatory capture and building up bureaucratic empires. And so the public ought to be, that's the purpose of a democracy, is to be suspicious and to put the brakes on government vested interests. And then activists. Activists have to be watched out for. They have hidden agendas. We, after all, in the Free Market Foundation are activists. And, everyone should ask, what are our agendas? And then experts, civil society, they cannot be presumed to be neutral and in good faith. One has to be clear about why they are engaged. And then the Free Market Foundation interest is the danger of countervailing intervention. Let me give you a simple and obvious example. If you force data prices to fall, what will you do to the poor who don't yet have coverage or don't yet have access or don't yet have technology? If you're worried about the poor, then what you should be worried about is whether the little dorps and villages and tribal towns have access anything better than 2G, and whether they will get 3G and 4G and LTE. And so if you're really worried about the poor, you want coverage and you want technology to reach the poor. And if you force data prices down, then you must understand that you are going to create a disincentive to investment in infrastructure and technology and rollout. And that's definitely one of the prices you pay, and the poor will be the victims. Here in Bryanston we will have LTE, but in Ventersdorp and Vergenoeg and Aansluit you will not. And then the acceptance of implausible facts is what struck us. The 5-country comparison, for example. All over the show it is repeated like a stuck record that India charges 11 rand, Nigeria 22, Namibia 32, and South Africa 149 or 150 for a gig of data. Now, as soon as I saw that, I thought that is so implausible that it can't possibly be true, or if it is true, that there's a very simple explanation, like it's subsidized or it's poor quality or there's something. It's not just simply a legitimate comparison. That it's obviously not a legitimate comparison, and you don't need to know any of the details to know it's not. It's self-evidently not, and so it turns out to be. Why those 4 were chosen out of 200 countries in the world? Interesting choice, or those 3 countries with which to compare us. And what's the source for this information? Who actually came to this conclusion? Is this hype or is this reality? And is there not a need for some sober socio-economic impact assessment of the kind that the International Telecommunications Union carries out and has carried out? And what does it say? What do we conclude from it? So we in the FMF, we want competition, and by competition we don't mean the presence of multiple competitors. That is not what competition constitutes or is about. Competition is contestability. Is something contestable? You can be the sole grocery store in a little village and you are not a monopoly unless there's some restriction on someone else entering. And the competition that you are subjected to is the threat of entry. That makes it competitive or contestable. That's what we need. Then we are of the view that there's no such thing as a free lunch, tonsttafel. If you have benefits such as cheap or free data, who pays? That is the one question we encourage everyone always to ask. We can all sit around the dinner table and say they should pay nurses more. But what you have the difficulty of saying is, from whom should that be taken? In order to pay nurses more, does that mean we have more potholes in the roads, or we have less police combating rape, or whatever? You must understand that if you divert resources to A, you divert them from B. And then there's this myth about market failure, which the Portfolio Committee and the Minister says there is market failure. Let's be very clear about this. I don't think there is such a thing as market failure, and there can't be such a thing as market failure because markets don't have objectives. Markets are a process. People can have failure. I can fail, you can fail, MTN can fail, the government can fail, the DA can fail, but a market can't fail. The market is not something with a mind or an objective. So what you have to say is, does the market produce an objective you want? And if it doesn't, then you should say that the market just isn't doing what you'd like it to do. And the market is people. The market is simply people freely trading with each other. And if the market produces soap opera or reality TV, I might not like it, but I can't call it market failure. I can't call reality TV market failure. On the contrary, it's market success. It's market successfully giving people what they happen to want. And market failure is usually just a synonym for somebody who would like markets to do different things. In other words, would like people to do different things. Markets are just people acting. And if you don't like what other people do, you can't call it failure. You must just say that they don't do what you'd like them to do. And you must come up with a way of getting your preferences satisfied. All new policies and laws in South Africa must be preceded by a socio-economic impact assessment done according to the guidelines published by the department and published by the presidency. There is none regarding this discourse. None. There was no mention of it, no discussion of it, and when I mentioned it to the to the chair of the portfolio committee. She did not seem to even know what a socio-economic impact assessment is. I'm sure she does, but she was somewhat surprised that it should be raised in this context. Then vested interests, we're very vigilant about them. I've mentioned them before, and I'm going to skip on. Now, is data a human right? The co-founder, so-called, of the internet, I don't know how you pronounce his name, probably some funny, unpronounceable French thing for something that's 2 syllables, Vint Cerf. He opposes the call for internet to be a human right and simply says it's an enabler. And what the United Nations says and what our Bill of Rights says is that people are free to express themselves. That does not mean you're entitled to a newspaper publishing your views, or a radio station broadcasting you, or a TV station broadcasting you, or a cinema showing your documentary. No. All that the human right is about is that you may not stop somebody expressing themselves, not that you have to provide them with the means by which to do it. There is no such human right, never has been, and no serious person proposes it. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, is about freedom of expression, and it was recently amended to say that includes the internet. That does not mean does not imply that anyone has to provide you with internet time or data or technology. And the South African Constitution is the same in our section 16, which is about freedom of, again, expression. Then there's some very, very flawed arguments. One of the strange things the International Telecommunications Union does, and most people do, is for some reason they calculate data charges as a proportion of income. Now that's very strange. Nobody does that for anything else. You don't do it for clothing. You don't say the amount people spend on T-shirts as a proportion of national income per capita is so much. You don't say that about peanut butter. You don't say that about soccer tickets. You don't say that about taxi fares or bus fares. So it's very strange that when it comes to data, somehow the national per capita income is presumed to be relevant. It is of zero relevance, and many millions of dollars have been spent doing calculations based on it. It's very strange, and everyone keeps repeating them, but it's of no relevance whatsoever. It's a non-factor variable. There's no reason why the poor should not pay more for something that is rare. That happens all the time. And what you do with the poor is you have welfare. If the poor can't afford a house, you don't say, oh, building contractors have to lower the price of houses because the poor can't afford them. No, what you do is you have a department of housing that provides housing for the poor, or an education department. So with data, there are all sorts of arguments that don't arise in any other context, that are just completely irrational and make no sense. And it's quite fascinating how they've just become widely accepted as legitimate and credible. Then there's no discussion of the role of incentives. Is if data falls, then what impact does that have on the incentives of new entrants? And bearing in mind, being a network provider does mean you have to have billions of rands of capital, but the assumption is there's no reason why small people should be able to enter into that market. There are any number of gigantic corporations and companies around, perfectly big and ugly enough to enter into the market if they think it's being abused or it's not competitive or it's being overcharged. And the reason why you will not overcharge is precisely because you do not want to attract another giant into your turf. You want to keep them out. So what you will do is make sure that it doesn't look attractive to competitors. That is what you do. And what the incentive for the existing service providers is to make sure no one else enters. If the government stops them entering by having very high license fees and very high tendering fees, which they do, they're very high, but they're a perfectly adequate number of people that can afford to pay that and would enter if the market were being exploited or cheated in any way. And then there's no understanding of the role of profits. This idea that they have excess profits, and it does seem at cursory glance, but not necessarily true, that South African service providers, network providers, have higher than average profits for Africa, but actually not higher than, for example, many other countries. They also seem to, and by the way, the same rhetoric prevails elsewhere. The network providers are fleecing the public and making super profits and exploiting and so on. But quite what that means is unclear. If they are subject to competition, and somebody under conditions of competition makes lots of money, that's an indication of the degree to which they've serviced people, to which they've served consumers, to which they've done good stuff. We should be thankful to them, build a monument to them if they make lots of profit under conditions of free and substantial competition. This is MTN's numbers, very simply put. MTN's profits after tax, and what it invested, 155% of its profits, in capital expenditure, building base stations and technology. And one of the things our companies do here, by the way, which is not done much elsewhere, is subsidize handsets. So the handsets come cheaper than elsewhere because they want people to be able to use them. Vodacom has invested 26 billion in infrastructure and capex over the past 2 years. And so the profits which they make do seem high by certainly African standards, but not by peer standards, by the way. Not by the standards of peer countries similar to ours. Similar GDP, similar size, similar population spread, similar demographics. Then the profits are also similar to our big companies. So what are some data facts? My Broadband, who's with us here today, published these corrections in response to that 4-country nonsense, to put it bluntly. And the numbers are that South Africa's are towards the high side, and these are the rates. Postpaid, 1 gig, 1.5 gig. You can't always compare like with like, 2 gigs. And also these figures here for prepaid. These are the ones which show that South Africa might be on the high side, but it's nothing like as absurd as 11 Rand versus 150 Rand for 1 gig, which is what the claim was. This is according to the ITU, the most expensive and cheapest data in the world. And what you can see here is that we certainly are not in the league of the top or the bottom. We're in fact roughly in the middle, as it happens, South Africa. And these are the cheapest in the world. And South Africa doesn't feature there, and in fact none of the countries that are in these studies. With India is there. India is there, one of the cheapest. Yeah. So now, what's interesting about it, by the way, is they omit the countries in which it's actually completely free, like South Korea and most of Mauritius and in Kuruleni. You know, there are many places where you now get free Wi-Fi. It's actually technically Wi-Fi, but people experience it as broadband. And in Korea, it is in fact broadband. So interestingly, it's not, of course, free. It's government funded. And what's interesting about the ones that are cheapest is to try and work out to what extent they're government funded. And some countries like India are a fully fledged federation. I know about India. I've actually written a book about India. And India is not uniform. So one of the problems you have is having one number for a country. And although the ITU tries to do that, it's actually not really technically legitimate at all because it's much more complicated. And in some states in India, such as don't just slip my mind where the IT industry is located, Bangalore, it's pretty much government subsidized by the state government, not the national government. And then there are cities all over the world in which they're subsidized. So these comparisons are very difficult. And the ITU says that the prices vary very widely for many reasons. And these are the highest prices in the world. So let me run through them. And it's interesting that these are omitted from the so-called 4-country study. And these are numbers according to the ITU. I have to say that I would like even to interrogate the ITU's conclusions, because I don't think it can be this simple. I don't think it's plausible that there's such a big variation with a level playing field. There has to be something else that explains it. You can't just look at the end result and draw conclusions. But nonetheless, these are the prices for 1 gig, for half a gig, The ITU uses 500 megabytes. And these are the numbers for the various countries. They go from the top downwards. Now you can see a rapid drop. These aren't all the countries. I've just taken a sample of countries. See you going down. And this is where South Africa fits in when we get to the end. So you can see, compared to many countries, we're towards the low end of countries. So what we really have to understand is that it's an extremely complex issue within a country. In other words, what does 1 gig cost in South Africa? It's almost impossible to say. And I invite you to go home and try and work that out by surfing the net. Or I can give you the publications. And if you can work out from this what 1 gig costs, you're doing a lot better than me. And I've spent some hours on it. So it is no simple single answer. It's extremely complicated within a country, let alone cross-country comparisons. Then there are big technological differences. What are you talking about? 2G, 3G, 4G, and LTE? And what coverage are you talking about? Lots of coverage, little coverage? It's extremely difficult and complicated. What about the variations not just within federations, but from city to city, or literally suburb to suburb? In many places varies. In a place like Switzerland, it will vary literally over a few kilometers, whether or not you have cheap or free or very expensive coverage. So although there are averages for Switzerland, I think Switzerland was in the list over there. No, it wasn't. I did have the Swiss number. It's on the low side, as it happens. So what we say is there's a need for facts. What is the real cost of providing data? Well, what are the license fees? In some countries, it's just allocated. There are no fees. In some countries, there are actual subsidies. In some countries, the fees, like here, are extremely high indeed. And so they must be added into the cost calculation. What is the regulatory cost? The threat, for example, of the ICT white paper, which threatens essentially nationalization of the existing infrastructure. So what effect does that have on the propensity of companies to want to recover their investment, past and present and future? And what is the infrastructure, what is the rollout that has to take place to underserved areas or areas with backward technology or unreliable? My wife and I have a little cottage in a town called Wakkerstroom, which is well known for birding. It's a birding center. I call it Slaapstroom or Doodsstroom for those of you who understand Afrikaans. But nonetheless, over there, you can't really use the internet. It's almost impossible. Unless you get a very specially beamed service that comes all the way from a private provider in Volksrust. But basically, if you try and use the MTN and Vodacom masts over there, you get very poor quality service. It's almost unusable. Sometimes you can't even open an email. It is so slow. So and then the spectrum, this unallocated spectrum in South Africa. What this does, for those of you who don't know, is because the government has sat on spectrum and been slow and tardy and reprehensible, frankly, at converting from analog to digital, and there's a lot of wavelengths that are simply not being made available. The result of that is that the network providers have to spend extra massive sums of money building extra base stations, which they would otherwise not have to do, and they have to try and run, and they're doing what's called refarming, is they're literally moving existing base stations away from 2G, in other words, poor people, to 4G LTE, in other words, mainly rich people. And they have to do that because the government has denied them spectrum, and of course that makes it much more expensive. And so there's a lot of incompetence in the administrative process. Then you have to understand bundles and cross-subsidies. You know, for example, your handset has been subsidized. So you have to say, well, you know, for that reason you're paying more for something else because there is no free lunch. Then, you know, I've mentioned governor. And then there are freebies. For example, we don't charge for voicemail, whereas most countries do. So what is the implication of that? How do you allocate that? It just happens to be the way the market has emerged here. And then there are promotions. Now the government says, when I pointed out how cheaply you can get a gig and bandwidth, the chair of the portfolio committee said, yes, but we don't accept specials. We don't accept promotions. We don't We don't regard them as relevant to the calculation. Well, why not? They are, in fact, the price that people pay for bandwidth. And so it goes. Then there are places with massive subsidies or little subsidies, and it's very, very, very difficult to work out what actually goes on. And frankly, anyone who produces a simplistic equation of one number for one country is actually misleading you. It can't be and never is quite that simple. So there are many issues that have to be addressed. So what we see is a need for lots of facts. There are a wide range of options in South Africa. For example, Access and AfriHost. Access provides you with a 3-month rollover. It doesn't expire at the end of the month. AfriHost has its own contract terms, and there are many other options available to South Africans at a wide range of prices, varying by as much as 300% or even more. Actually, as I say, my own contract is 0, the data part of it, the 1 gig. So they're very dubious comparisons. No single number is usually legitimate. International data is very difficult to assess. And then this widely cited study that South Africans spend 20 or 25, 24, I've seen different numbers, percent of their salary on internet usage, which is well above international telecommunications guideline of 25%. Well, is that true? According to Africa Check, which checked this out, they say no, it's actually below 4%. And according to the International Telecommunications Union, this is South Africa's percentage, as a percentage of gross national income per capita. And as I said, that's a completely meaningless number. It should have no relevance whatever. What the national income is, what the cost of data is, has got no connection with it. Then there's these are other countries. According to the ITU, Malawi is 70% of people's per capita income. Now, again, I would say immediately, regardless of how sophisticated the source, the ITU, one has to be suspicious about such a number. It just seems implausible. It can't be that simple. But nonetheless, these are the high-end numbers, the highest in the world. And as I say, using gross national income is a meaningless marker. This is interesting. The 500 megabyte, according to the ITU, worldwide coverage, South Africa falls into the second lowest quintile. And in fact, this is about 200 to 400 rand per gig. In fact, we are said to be 150 rand per gig. So we should really be in the bottom quintile. However, the ITU is no doubt using the same methodology for all countries, so we can't juggle around one. But however you look at it, we are at or near the bottom. In other words, cheapest according to the ITU, and this is the most sophisticated study as far as I know that's available. And these are internet development quintiles, and you can see again that South Africa is towards the bottom here. We're not one of the best, which means we need lots more investment and capital investment, which means we need companies that can generate enough income and capital to be able to get us to catch up with the leading countries that are more advanced than we are. This is the development index again, the ICT development index for Africa, I think. What am I looking at over here? No, yes, these are all the African countries, I think. This is the one I chose to put in, and you can see we are one of the most developed, one of the most advanced, and therefore, but nonetheless, we are below the world average. This is the world average, the developing country average, and the African continent average. So we need lots of technology and investment in South Africa to catch up and keep up with the world's technological revolution. So the last slide then is, where do we go from here? And I would argue that we have to create a realistic and informed climate of opinion. And that's really one of the reasons we would appeal to the media and journalists, is please be critical, ask critical questions, and try to make sure that we have policies based on sound information and objective analysis, critical information. And demand objective information and sources. Beware of rhetoric and reckless demands. Just make prices fall as if that can be done. and conduct proper socio-economic impact assessments or require of the government that they do so. They are obliged to do so. And the final then is a slide with, I close with Milton Friedman, who said one of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. And I would say just beware of policies that have good intentions and support policies that have good results, good consequences. That is what we would like to achieve. So I hope that has been a contribution, and I am afraid that we raised more questions than answers, and I think that is what we would encourage everyone in this room to go away and do, ask the right questions. Thank you.
I'm sure there are quite many questions on the floor. May I ask that you give your name and where you're from when you give your question, please? Eddie?
Can I make an observation? Malcolm Russell, Broadcast Development Group. I wondered, Leon, if I could trouble you to go back on a slide. Have a look at that one that showed the 5 comparisons between India, South Africa, etc., etc. And I just want to raise a thought here. I'm going to use an analogy which relates to radio broadcasting, because if I were a radio broadcaster, which I was, my objective would be to say, I want to put a transmitter up in such a way that it reaches a mass audience. Now, the first thing I do is say, okay, let's assume, just for argument's sake, that I could reach the whole of South Africa, but I would need X number of transmitters. I could reach the whole of India if I were there, and I would need X number of transmitters. I would then do the sum of saying, how many people per square kilometer are there available for those transmitters? India, if you look at people per square kilometer, according to Wikipedia, is 450 people per square kilometer. South Africa is 41. Now, do the sums there between 11 rand to reach that number of people.
1.2 billion now.
It doesn't, we're doing very well with those prices.
There is a study which unfortunately is not public and we can't release and I can't cite.
At the moment.
At the moment. It's quite a sophisticated peer study where South Africa is compared with its peers. And these, you're quite right, are not our peers and therefore are illegitimate comparisons for the reasons you give and others. And also the quality of service differs enormously. The geology, everything differs enormously. And so, for example, in India, just to give you one little technical detail, of which there are many, India has a surplus of electricity, unlike South Africa. And the reason is they're deregulated and privatized, and now there are too many people generating electricity. And so what happens is all the service network providers can get cheap and free electricity. Over here they have to have their own generators and solar panels. And
then they get stolen.
So there are lots of little details like that. But the study of peer countries, and as soon as we can we will make that available, and I'm sure my broadband probably has it already, or but it'll be made available. But you're absolutely right. When you look at peer countries, we are in fact one of the cheapest. Even with these dodgy attempts to reduce it to one number, that, as I said, is inherently dodgy. But when that is done and you try and compare apples with apples, then we are towards the low end of peer countries.
Does anyone know where these 4 countries came from, members of the media? Do they, because it suddenly just appeared and then it was taken up on social media and suddenly it became the comparative basket. Anyone know where they were picked out of?
Why these 4?
Why these 4?
The portfolio committee asked and they got no answer either. So it's quite strange.
A feeling, but I don't know if I'm right or not, that it started with Touch Central.
It did. No, it came from, but I wonder
but
why
I don't
brought these 4 countries.
As best we could tell, it was tweeted at him. So he...
Yes,
so
and then he retweeted it.
Yeah, so it's just numbers that he gathered from supporters on Twitter. That's as best we could gather.
So
I
there's
have
basically
heard of a
nothing.
private, again, I hope this isn't confidential, of a private conversation with Thibaut Touch and Gareth Cliff in which they said that. So I think that is correct. And they said they're quite happy to be given correct information. They're quite happy to accept that that's not correct. But the trouble is, it's now out in them. It's become the meme. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Orisan from SABC News. Actually, my question is that because most of my listeners believe
Yes.
that is that. How
Yes.
do we reverse now? If I go and say, you are saying this, are they going to believe you?
That's the trouble. The trouble when something becomes an axiom of truth is it's very difficult to correct. And that's one of the reasons why we appeal to people like you to try to be a little bit, you normally do, of course. The press is normally very diligent about this. But for some reason, this got through without any real critical examination. So the best you can do is, I don't know, just query it. Plant seeds of doubt.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I never mentioned my name. I'm Katie from RNME. I would suggest that the best way to kind of perhaps change the view, you need to start with the court of public opinion, and you probably need to start from whence it came. So probably the best way would be to make sure Gareth Cliff and Thibaut Touch have the proper information. Then following that, hopefully have one or both of them speak out on the matter.
We will be approaching them, and we'll try to meet with them and try to get it. So we don't have any kind of people we think of as on our side or not. We assume everyone's on our side, and we will approach everyone with a sense of
I know
goodwill.
personally that Gareth really likes you guys. Thibaut, I don't know him, so I can't speak for him. But Gareth, I know, is open to.
And he's had a lot of our
opinions.
people on
Yes.
his podcast, so we know that. And so we have absolutely good faith view. We think it's mistaken, and we'd like to correct it, and we'd like people like you to help us. But we will be meeting with Gareth and hopefully Thibaut and try to get balance. We're quite happy to find out that there really is a problem in South Africa that needs fixing. We just at this stage, it's not obviously so.
Hi, I'm Nick Count from HTXT Africa. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that you've had an unconvincing response from the service providers, the industry. Have you had any response at all?
That's also, sorry, Leon, if I might say, that's not to us, that's exactly something unconvincing response in the media.
Within in the court of public opinion?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, there was, as 702 said at an early stage, there had been zero response. And then eventually Vodacom, I think, came out with a bit
Vodacom
of...
has and Telkom have now spoken.
Telkom but to me it's quite amazing that they can be under this extraordinary attack and not respond. So we're engaging with them. We have a good relationship now with MTN. We're meeting with them regularly, challenging them with all the questions. They are trying to help us, but still they are not engaging in the court of public opinion, which to us is quite strange.
Have you approached them as a journalist?
That's not the one. Well, I'm here for somebody else, basically. So we have.
Yeah.
Duncan McLeod from Tech Central.
Yes, and I've seen your stuff, and you also a great source of information, for which many thanks.
Oh, thank you. Leon, I just wanted to get the Free Market Foundation's view, if you have one, on spectrum allocation. You mentioned that the government's been very tardy in allocating additional spectrum to the mobile operators. But there are different views on how the spectrum should be allocated. The regulator, ICASA, for example, and many countries around the world have allocated spectrum by means of an auction, going to the highest bidder. Is that the best model, though? Because the operators can drive up those prices quite high. We saw that happen with 3G auctions, for example, in Europe. Is there a danger that, what's the Free Market Foundation's view on this? Is an auction the best way of doing this, or should it be a beauty contest, as they called it? What's the best model?
Duncan, I would have preferred you to be answering that question. I think everyone who doesn't know you should know that you are probably one of the best placed people to answer it. and have thought about it and written about it a lot more. I suppose what we would say in the foundation, what we want is markets to work. That doesn't mean we know the best way to get them to work. For example, I'll give you a practical example that is related in the sense that the energy has to come from them. Eskom. We think electricity should be deregulated, the system unbundled into a network provider and various generating entities and so on, with or without privatization, but we have no corporate view on the best way to do that. In other words, do you do it immediately? Do you do it over time? Do you do it by inviting new bidders into the market? Do you do it by, there are many ways of doing it. So I think my personal view, and I can't speak for others in the foundation, by the way, we have an interesting approach here. We have very few free market foundation views. We practice what we preach, freedom, and each one of us speaks for themselves, basically. My view would be what ICASA wants, which is an auction. That seems to me to be the most efficient way of allocating a scarce resource, is a price mechanism. And then once you've said an auction, of course, as you well know, that there are many ways to have an auction. There's not one simple formula for an auction. But that would be my preference, as an auction process. And in that sense, I would say I'm with ICASA. And I think you are too, from what I've gathered, yeah.
Any more questions? Well, if anyone does want to speak to Leon afterwards, or myself.
Well, could I just make the point that we do have some very knowledgeable people in the room, and I'm happy for them to make a contribution rather than to pretend that I'm some sort of oracle with knowledge.
Anyone else like to make some comments about data charges, telecoms market? Okay. Well,
Thank
if you
you.
do, please write to me or Leon, and very happy. Or join us on Twitter, our Data Facts Twitter following.
And if anyone knows what this means, please come and tell me.
Also, Leon mentioned Africa Check, which had done the report on percentage of income. The report is here if anybody would like it, if you haven't seen it. Happy to give it out. And there will be a media release following, which will go out following this event, if that will help. I think it might. Okay. Well, I think that's all. If no more questions or nothing, okay. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
There will be a Free Market Foundation evening event, which is open to the public as well as the media, on the 30th, I think it is, with Ivor Vector, who is also talking about data must fall. And then we'll be having a media briefing event in probably the middle of January on the ICT policy white papers. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.